He is Associate Professor of History at Wellesley College. His book titled House But No Garden, Apartment Living in Bombay Suburbs, 1898 to 1964 was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2013. He is also the co-editor with Douglas Haynes of a special issue of the journal South Asia titled Beyond the Colonial City, Re-evaluating the Urban History of India, 1920 to 1970. Currently on a senior research fellowship of the American Institute of Indian Studies, he is researching his new book project, tentatively titled From Improvement to Gentrification, Property, Citizenship and Cooperative Housing in 20th Century Bombay. The book project focuses on the enterprise of cooperative housing in the post-independence Bombay and the implications of this enterprise for notions of the property and urban citizenship. I would like to hand over the mic to Nikhil Rao for the discussion.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you for this chance to speak about this book project. As you'll see, it's very much still in the researching mode or phase. So this is sort of very, work in progress. So just let's start by considering two middle-class families. Okay, one in about 1950, lower middle class family in Bombay, as it was called then, and that family in 1950 would have had, I would say, two important considerations, right? One important consideration for low middle class family would have been to secure a good education for the children in the family. So good education hopefully would lead to a good job and some sort of financial security. A second important consideration for this 1950 hypothetical family would be securing a good marriage for the children. And by securing a good marriage and by securing good education and thereby a good job, I think the assumption was that the middle class family could basically reproduce itself, right? Economically, socially, biologically, through good education, good marriage, it could continue onward into the next generation. You look at an equivalent family now, about 30 years later, in about 1980. And I would suggest that in addition to these two preoccupations with education and with marriage, there's now a third preoccupation. What is that third preoccupation? The third preoccupation is, if at all possible, to somehow secure an ownership flat, right, that can be passed on and that the family could continue to live in, right? So this had not been a preoccupation in 1950, but by 1980, it was a preoccupation. It was, obviously, it remained for many, if not for most, an aspiration, but nonetheless, the aspiration to own one's own flat was, I would say, one of the sort of dominant features of middle-class sensibility in the city by 1980. So the book project that I'm working on is basically trying to understand this. How did this city, which in 1950 was overwhelmingly a city of renters, and if you looked at wealthy people or at poor people, they didn't sort of matter, the class didn't matter. I mean, obviously they rented different kinds of places, but people overwhelmingly rented. You look at the city in 1980, and obviously the majority of people are not owning, but that aspiration to, if at all possible, own has become constitutive of a sort of middle class sensibility. So that's what this this book is trying to understand, and it's trying to do this through looking at the sort of changing trajectory of cooperative housing. As probably most of you would know, the ownership flat in Mumbai is almost synonymous with cooperative housing, right? If you think of like, oh, I'm going to buy a flat, most likely that flat will be in a cooperative housing society. Right? Perhaps some of you grew up in such societies. Perhaps some of you aspire to own a flat in such a society. Right? How did that happen? Because if you look at the history of cooperative housing, and if you look at the history of housing societies, they weren't sort of so tightly linked to this idea of ownership, of like the ownership flat. Okay? So what I'll do in my time today is sort of lay out in a somewhat schematic way the evolution and transformation of cooperative housing society from its inception in colonial Bombay in the 1910s to the sort of end of the period that I'm considering here, that is by, say, the 1980s or by the 1980s, okay? And I'm going to try and, again, somewhat schematically map out three different types of cooperative housing society that, in a sense, also represent a transformation, right? Movement from one to the second to the third. So the first cooperative housing societies were established in the 1910s. And in fact, 1915 is when the very first such society was established. Some of you might know the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society in Gamdevi was the first society, not just in this city, but not just in India, but in Asia, right? And the concern here was, I would say there were two primary concerns. One, that people coming to the city, often from the village, wanted to live among their own, right? People from their own community, people from their own religious caste community, whatever, right? A second important consideration or concern was wanting to control rents, wanting to control and protect themselves. People wanted to protect themselves from sort of unscrupulous landlords who, in a context of no rent control, basically saw it fit to rent and evict tenants, hike rents and evict tenants as they pleased, right? And this is a period during the First World War when the city experienced quite a boom in economic activity, and associated with that a kind of hike in rents. So what the first societies, which included the Saraswat Society that I've mentioned, but also societies like those set up by Parsis in Dadar Parsi colony, those set up by Catholics in Salsette, so-called Salsette Catholic Cooperative Housing Society in Bandra, societies set up by Pathare Prabhus, sort of various communities set up these societies. Their primary consideration was to have a stable sort of monthly outgoing, that is to be protected from unpredictable rent hikes, and to be able to sort of live among one another and sort of thereby, in their view, more effectively manage the challenges of urban living, right? How do we live together without losing our identity, or how do we live together and kind of come to an agreement as to how this building should look, what it should be used for, how the spaces should look like, and so on and so forth. So what the model of cooperative housing really tried to do was to leverage the power of the collective, right? And it was explicitly sort of conceived in this way, as Rao Bahadur S.S. Talmaki was the sort of founding father of the Saraswat Housing Society, as he wrote, that cooperative housing represented a sort of middle way between, on the one hand, the free market where the individual sort of stood naked before the forces of the market, and on the other hand, a sort of socialist model where the state basically owned everything. Right? And cooperative housing had this intermediate character to it, where it wasn't entirely private ownership because there was a collective, right? And it wasn't it wasn't state ownership either, because there was a collective, right? That was significantly smaller than the state or than the national collective. Okay, so and this was sort of encouraged by the colonial state, by the British, in the first legislations, first cooperative legislations of 1912, 1925, where they actively encouraged the formation of societies on the basis of community. Now please note that I'm not trying to romanticize this. Obviously this formation on the basis of community had oppressive and exclusionary dimensions to it, right? I'm trying to show how the thinking, or I'm trying to indicate what the thinking at the time was. I'm not celebrating it. Okay, now you had this moment of the first enthusiasm for cooperative societies, and this was in conjunction with these new areas coming up in the city, right? In the 1920s, Shivaji Park a little later, but Dadar, Matunga, parts of Salsette were being developed through town planning schemes. And so you had these societies that came up in the late 1910s, early 1920s. Then there was a bit of a sort of lapse for reasons that I'm not going to get into in detail, but I can certainly address later. And you sort of have a real lull in the movement until independence and partition, after which the cooperative movement is seen by the state government of the then Bombay state as a way to deal with the new or renewed housing crisis, right? And most directly occasioned by the influx of partition refugees, Sindhis, Punjabis primarily, right? And so land was made available through the Bombay Housing Board, which was set up in 1948, the predecessor of today's MAHADA. Societies were formed still on the basis of this sort of community model. And again here, the Bombay state saw this as a way to kind of encourage self-help. And if you look at documents from this time, you see that after a little while, the first initial spurt of enthusiasm for helping their displaced brothers and sisters, you start to see a sort of weariness on the part of government at the effort required to rehouse these refugees. And so cooperative housing seemed to offer a form of self-help. Land might be made available at concessional rates, maybe credit is extended, but then after that, people would sort of form their own societies and manage their own affairs. And again, some of you might know, some of these early societies formed in the aftermath of partition included Sham Nivas and Nanik Nivas in Kampala Hill, Navjeevan Society in Lamington Road, and also in Mahim, and so on and so forth, right? So this is a sort of brief extension of that organization on the basis of community as collective. Now at the national level, too, in independent India, as planning got underway with the first plan in 1951, cooperatives in general and cooperative housing in particular fit in with Nehruvian developmental ideology, which, as you might know, again tried to sort of forge a distinctive path that was neither entirely socialist nor entirely nor market oriented, nor sort of free market oriented, right? It's well known, of course, that the Nehruvian state seized for itself the so-called commanding heights of the economy, but less well known is how important a role was assigned to cooperatives. And here again, a huge range of cooperatives were envisioned and also supported, right? Cooperatives for everything ranging from various forms of agriculture to credit and also to housing. So here again, and here of course one of Nehru's main advisors on this and a kind of key proponent of cooperative form of as an economic model appropriate for India was the great economist and development thinker KRVIA. So again, this appeared to be a middle way, which was neither entirely based on state ownership, nor was it based on private ownership. But again, here was a model that sought to leverage the power of the collective, that sought to leverage the community, right? And sought to leverage communities. Now, of course, in independent India, that sought to develop a certain kind of secular society, the model of organization on the basis of communities that were caste or religion based didn't fit easily, right? So you see in the case of housing that there was encouragement of cooperative societies, but the collectives that were encouraged were organized on a different basis, right? So you see, for instance, if you think of the schemes that were developed by the government of India that were then embraced by the housing board, right? Schemes like the subsidized industrial housing scheme for industrial workers, the low-income groups, the middle-income group scheme, right? These are schemes that try to organize people on the basis of class, on the basis of their income, right? If you look at a famous example of this early activity by the state government and MADA working together, would be Bandra East, developed in the late 50s, but really in the 60s, right? Where on one side, on the western side, you have these MADA middle-income group settlements, and on the eastern side of Bandra East, you have these societies that are for the cultural contributors. So you have Kalanagar, Sahitya Savas, Patrakar Society, and Architect for architects and technicians, right? So again, here, this is perhaps the most striking example of a kind of the state trying to encourage collectives that in this instance were sort of somehow presumed to be linked by the fact that they shared occupations or vocations, if you will. Now, many other such societies came up in the 50s and the 60s where often MADA or the state government would make land available for very often various kinds of government employees, employees of a certain bank, for LIC employees, Life Insurance Corporation employees, right? So various kinds of collectives came together that were organized on the basis of occupation, work, and class, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, and this was, I think, possible, again, I'm being a bit speculative here, but I think this was possible because if you think about what happened in the 50s, Bombay expanded in two more phases from the island, just the island city, to suddenly taking up 2/3 of Salsette Island, right? So suddenly the state government found itself to be a major landholder in the city of Greater Mumbai, which it hadn't been in the island city, right? So the state government had all of this land that it was able to make available, that it made available to these societies. Okay? Now, so here I think I've sketched out two kinds of models, right, on the basis of which societies organize themselves. The first was the original early 20th century model, moment in the 1910s and early 20s when societies were formed on the basis of religious caste communities. Immediately after independence, you see a little bit of that in the efforts to rehabilitate refugees. Then you see sort of the state government more actively encouraging different kinds of communities, right, that are formed on the basis of occupation, income, and so on, right? What these two models shared is, of course, firstly, the emphasis on community. What they also shared is the process. It looked like this. A group of people would come together, okay? They would decide, okay, we're going to live together. We are going to live together because we feel like something binds us, and we are going to sort of also, we would like to control the circumstances under which we live. So we get together, we form a society, and then we engage an architect, we engage a contractor, and we arrange, we have some oversight over the kind of structure that is put up. Again, very typical, in the earlier societies that are organized on the basis of community, you would see that maybe some kind of religious space is included in the building that is put up, some kind of space perhaps for community celebrations, right? And these kinds of examples are examples of how it is the community that work to try and determine the built environment within which they live. Now, while this is going on, sometime in the 50s, right, some people basically reversed the process that I've just described. That is, instead of a collective constituting itself on the basis of some perceived affinity, you had someone who said, oh, I'm just going to put up a building. Then I'm going to sell off some of these flats. Right? Once the flats that have been sold off have reached the number that is required to form a society, then these people can form a society. And then I'll just stay involved until all the flats are sold off, and then I just exit the deal. Right? This is the birth of what we will later come to know as the builder. Right? Initially, these kinds of buildings we couldn't call these figures builders because we were talking about building a building here, a building there, and sort of selling them and then moving on. Right? So not the kind of association we have, yes, with a builder where they sort of acquire huge tracts of land and then sort of put up on a purely speculative basis a bunch of buildings, and they have access to different kinds of resources today. But this is really a revolutionary moment when this reversal of the process takes place, because then you have a community that may or may not constitute itself after the fact. Right? And of course, the stories of societies that are plagued with, strife, quarrel, this, that, and the other are too numerous. Everyone perhaps has some sort of experience with this. Right? Now, I'm not saying that societies that are formed on the basis of community are free from quarrel or whatever. Again, my emphasis here is really not to celebrate one model over the other, but rather to show how the process changes, and as a result, the thing that is at the center of all of this, that is the dwelling, the meaning of that changes as well. Right? And so what you see with this third model that emerges maybe sometime in the 50s, right? In fact, you see so much of it in the 50s that in the early 60s, a whole important new legislation is drafted, the Maharashtra Ownership of Flats Act, right? Which is drafted precisely to sort of control this kind of proliferation of these ownership flats where one person is coming up, one person or a group of people, and they're just putting up a building and then sort of selling off flats. Sometimes they're sort of selling off the flats, and they're continuing the building process as and when they're able to sell off flats. A lot of people got ripped off in this process, and to kind of try and regulate all of this, this new legislation was enacted. A very important legislation that has recently, well not that recently, but about a decade ago, been superseded by the RERA, right? The Real Estate Regulation Act. But what you see now is this third model that kind of gains in popularity, that gains in ubiquity, and that, again, for reasons that I'm still trying to work out, increasingly sort of displaces the earlier form where the collective comes together and tries to control the process and to sort of determine the form, the built environment within which they would come to live, right? And it's really interesting, like when you look at documents or discussions of this issue from the time, that third form that I've just described to you is often described as fake or like not genuine and so on and so forth. And for a long time, I tried to kind of understand why it was referred to as fake. And I think the sort of tentative proposition I'm going to go with here is because in the view of the people who supported what they claimed to be authentic or genuine cooperative housing, the whole emphasis was not on the ownership part. The emphasis was on living together, having a controlled monthly outgoing, on managing one's own affairs by working together, right? Whereas with this third model, the dwelling comes to resemble more what we call the ownership flat, a piece of private property that is more subject to speculation, to being viewed as not just something that I use to live in for shelter, but that potentially I can sell and make a lot of money off of, right? So it's a very important moment in how housing is perceived, in my view. So I've spoken quite a bit. I've sketched out these three models. I'm going to end by, in a very speculative way, just making two observations about changes in the 70s that say push things in the direction of the third of the three sort of models that I've sketched out, right? One is, of course, the fact that in the 70s, land prices go up. Again, I haven't worked out the mechanics of this, but by all accounts, the 70s were a sort of transformative moment, just even in the basic equation of what it costs to put up a structure, right? Some people that I've talked to with knowledge of the industry say that in the 50s, certainly, and even into the 60s, the cost of material, especially cement, was a very significant factor in the total cost of building. The cost of land was never trivial, but the huge change that you see by the 80s is the cost of land just skyrockets, and the cost of material probably sinks with the sort of decontrol of cement and the increased availability of cement, right? So you have a sort of change in the equation. The state government and parastatal agencies like MADA no longer are able to be as generous. Again, I don't know the exact picture here, but you certainly see that even if you just look at MADA reports from the 80s as opposed to the 60s, they're not just sort of inviting people to come and form cooperative societies anymore, as they were, and offering land. Again, if you talk to someone, they'll say, oh yeah, Urban Land Ceiling Act, this is often thrown as a sort of big explanation, and undoubtedly it played an important role. I personally have it worked out anything further than this idea that as a result, what many other people have written, that certain groups of people who had the connections and the resources were able to capture the supply of land for themselves and were able to therefore push things in the direction of the third model, whereby housing becomes increasingly commodified. So that's one kind of speculative and extremely incomplete proposition as to why, by the over the course of the 1970s, the equation or the balance of cooperative housing models, so to speak, shifts in the direction of the third that I've described. A second, probably even more speculative proposition that I haven't worked out, other than just very impressionistically in my head, is a certain kind of demographic change and associated sort of geographic dispersal of, especially of these lower middle class and middle class groupings, who, if you look at the 30s and the 40s, were still living in the older parts of the city. Even lower middle class people at this time might have been living in Charles, right? But you see, firstly, these people who in the 30s might have been single and come as single men from the Konkan or from South India or elsewhere. By the 60s and 70s, they have families, they have children, and they command more resources, and they are leaving those older parts of the city. They're moving first to areas like, at that time, relatively new, Dadar, Matunga, Shivaji Park, but then they're moving over the 60s and 70s still further out into places like Chembur and obviously the western suburbs that are opening up, and they're moving into ownership flats in cooperative housing societies, right? They're not moving into bigger child type setups. They're moving into these, and I think this sort of, again, remains extremely unrigorous here, if you will, but I think this big demographic transformation has something to do with the kind of proliferation and ubiquity of the ownership flat by the 1980s. So I'll stop here, and by thanking you again for giving me this.
Thanking Mr. Rao on behalf of KRVIA for this remarkable speech. The stage is now open to questions.
Thank you for the lovely presentation. I just had a question that what intrigued you to study about this cooperative housing, its history? So just that.
I guess, there are two answers to that. One is the more academic answer, which is that my first big project was a kind of study of the rise of the flat, the ownership flat, as a sort of building type, right? So not from the point of view of occupancy patterns, but rather as a sort of building type. I kind of was interested in the movement from the child to the flat, the movement of the toilet inward into the dwelling, and things like this. So that was perhaps a topic that was somewhat a little bit of architectural history. And as I was doing that, I sort of realized that, I was observing that all buildings are societies that emerge, right? Especially in the post-independence period. So that, I was like, oh, okay, there's something really interesting here that I couldn't go into in that first project. And then, of course, I also grew up in a society. So I kind of had that experience, and I knew how ubiquitous and significant they are in the life of Mumbai, but I haven't seen any work that really talked about their.
Hi. So I had a question. Thank you for running us through a comprehensive understanding of the history. But if you were to design for the future, would you consider model? Hello. Yeah. Would you consider a model such as Vienna possible in Mumbai? Like, since we had a past that was a mix of socialist and private, would something like a state-owned, subsidized housing, which can be rented out, be like a solution? Or would you say it's almost a little risky in the politicized, religious community state that we have in Mumbai?
Not sure I fully got the question, but I'm just going to speak loudly without the mic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I certainly think that there's place for at least a segment of housing that is removed from like strictly market considerations, that is sort of decommodified. Yes, I believe that. I'm not an expert on finding housing solutions for the present day predicament. Safely a historian. But as a sort of layperson and someone who, that's my opinion, yeah, that there should be or that it would be good to have at least some housing that is available for rental at an affordable cost.
But in that phase where you described that there was occupation-based housing,
Yeah.
Was there any case studies of conflicts based on like religious communities?
Oh, of course, I'm sure there were. I'm sure, I mean, I haven't come across case, I'm not doing like field work or ethnography, but I'm sure because we know that, I mean, just because you say occupation, that doesn't mean caste and all of that goes away, right? I mean, it's still there very much. I'm sure there would have been that, absolutely.
Thank you.
So when we talk, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I mean, I've lived in cooperative housing societies all my life, between Bangalore and Delhi. So when you sort of talk about the way they started out, how did they exactly pitch this legal framework? Because who owned the land at the time? Because you have multiple sort of homeowners in the middle. You didn't have one landlord owning multiple people in the building.
Yeah.
You had like either a
Well,
collective.
yeah, absolutely.
So
So
how
in
was
the,
pitch to the government as well? Like who decided that legal framework of who can?
yeah, good question. Well, the first thing is, I would not use that term homeowners, I guess, because, you know, like I said, especially like if you look at the societies from a century ago, the emphasis really wasn't on home ownership. And as far as I've been able to tell, there often was a mix, but in many of the societies, you had someone who owned, say, 20 to 30%. That is, they had shares in the society worth 20 to 30% of the value of their dwelling. There was no prospect of them ever owning. It wasn't like a hire purchase or a mortgage kind of
You
deal.
can't sell it off of.
You can sell it off, but then the society will get the 2/3 value if you have a 1/3 value. That was the understanding then. But you know, people didn't think, and in fact, it was, if anything, seen as preferable because you had some more flexibility because you didn't have as much skin in the game, so to speak, right? Again, I think there were different kinds of models. You know, there were people who might have owned outright, right? But I know, for instance, that in the Kalmaki Wadi in KRVIA, which is also a big Saraswat society, there were people who were tenants, right? But they were members of, and they paid a rent, right? So there were different kind of arrangements, but my feeling is that at that time, the emphasis was less on ownership. Now the land question is a very good one. It's the society that basically has whatever tenure it is over the land, right? in many of these societies, they were also sort of pioneering in that they came up on these lands that had been sort of developed by the colonial state. So if it was here in Salsette, it might have been town planning schemes, which you see in Bandra, Andheri, Santa Cruz, everywhere, right? In places like Dadar and Matunga, it would have been a BIT scheme, Bombay Improvement Trust scheme, and so on. So it's always a society.
Anyone else has a question? We'll end the session with this. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.